Good morning, everybody. I'm about to make a short commentary on Lecture 11 of the Foundations of Esotericism. This is definitely one of those lectures that is very hard to comment on. In fact, I should probably just sit here and read the whole lecture to you. It is also one of those lectures that are best understood when Steiner says it's better to read one lecture 50 times than 50 lectures once. It is a third of the way through the lecture cycle, and it definitely starts to bring in the themes into relationship with each other in very strong ways. And this particular lecture cycle, this lecture, I've given the title Karma and the Three Worlds, the physical, the astral, and the spiritual world. It also could be called the relationship of the self-conscious ego and selflessness. So there are some themes that I'd like to just enumerate, and a few things that I'm going to read to you. So he is asking us to work out how do we become conscious of ourself. He calls the ego, or the I of the human being, the self, or ego consciousness is when we become conscious of ourself. And to become conscious of ourself in different planes of consciousness, we need senses. So at a certain level, we need to be able to relate to the world, the plane of existence around us, and in relating to that, we become aware of ourselves. But the further development requires us to become selfless in that realm. And this lecture deals with that at a certain level on how we become selfless in the physical realm. He also then says we need to develop higher organs of perception, which he calls spiritual senses or devachanic senses. And this is a very interesting theme for us to follow with anthroposophy and with spiritual philosophy, is do we really understand what it means to develop senses that can perceive in higher planes, in the astral world and the mental world, as they are called here in this particular lecture. So I'll just read a couple of the sentences that I found really interesting. Only when we gain senses adapted to a particular world can we become self-conscious in that world. At present we only have senses for the physical world, but the other worlds continually play into the consciousness of self and cloud it. When feelings play into our consciousness on the physical plane, it is the astral world, and when we think, the mental world is playing into the consciousness on the physical plane. So we have a consciousness on the physical plane through the physical senses, but already through our feelings and through our thoughts, we become conscious of the astral and the spiritual world. But we only have such higher thoughts when senses awaken for the mental world. That is, not only when we think the thoughts, but perceive them around us as beings. Now this is quite an interesting thought, that we can think thoughts, but we can also develop ways of perceiving the thoughts as being. These are known as the spiritual senses. So he then also asks us, I'll come back to that in a moment, but he is also says, how do we begin to school ourselves on the physical plane? He says that there's a balance between becoming a self-conscious self and the path towards selflessness. So when we want to develop ourselves on the physical plane, he gives us 3 places where we can begin to become selfless. He says the objects on the physical plane compel us to become selfless and to give something to the object which is not the I. So we can give something to the world that is not just me, my meanness. We can, in our social interaction with each other on the physical plane, learn to become a contributor, so to say, of the creation of a better society, of a better world, by renouncing certain things in ourselves. These are all maybe trigger words for people these days, but when we start to go up along the process of moral development, of spiritual development, we have to learn to become selfless, firstly in the realm of desires, then also in the realm of wishes, and thirdly in the realm of thoughts. So we have to learn that we can't just push our desires on the world around us. So we feel desires arise within us, but we have to go a pathway in a way of putting those in the background. And the same comes with wishes. When we wish something in the world that is just only in accordance with our own wishes, but we can also align our wishes with what comes to us from outside. This is something that is a little bit countercultural today, is that we are sort of being told by the world of media that we should desire and wish what we want, and if we follow our wishes, then all will be well. But actually, if we want to be a contributor to a better society, we have to learn to relativize our self-wishes with that which comes to us, what the world needs around us. And then we can do the same with the will. So our desires, our wishes, but in what we do in our will, we can start to act in accordance with the thoughts that arise not only within us, but we can surrender ourselves to the thoughts which are not our own. So these are, of course, big words, and they are full of danger, because of course we can just surrender ourselves to thoughts of some mad person. We can just surrender our will to the formation of a group, or of something that is not very constructive towards ourselves and community. But in that sense of balancing what is in ourself and what is selfless, we can start to find ways to school how our desires, our wishes, and our thinking can be open to what we would call the greater ideas. And this is where he says that the schooling towards selflessness demands meditation. So we can take some lofty thoughts given to us by the divas, by the healers, the men and women who have been the leaders of society and of spiritual development of the world, and start to use those thoughts to, in a way, train and to rein in our wishes and our desires and our thoughts, so that our will can become more constructive in reading what the wishes of the world, the needs of the world, and the sort of the directives that are needed in the world for us to participate. So, for example, we could take a mantra like "Wisdom lives in the light," which comes later in this series, and if we train our thoughts to understand what that means, that wisdom lives in the light, then our thinking can start to learn how to remove itself from our self-interested, our egotistical thoughts, where our ego is bound up with our self-interest, and to start to become more selfless towards finding higher organization of thinking, feeling, and willing. Or in this lecture, he says it is a higher training of our thinking, our wishes, and our desires. He then also talks about how these are also important forces within us, that it is through our desires that we can move from one area in our life to another. And he, at the end of the lecture, talks about how desire is a very important part of karma. Not only does the desire for further development take us into higher planes of understanding and development, but it's also our desire to fix up where our thoughts, our will, our actions, and our desires and our wishes have created an inscription that was not so constructive to humanity. In other words, we create a karma, and action requires a counterbalancing initiative in the world. And if we have died and have gone into the spiritual world, it is the desire. He says that there are 12, I think it says 12, is it 10 or 12? Let me just have a look. There are 12 forces which draw us back in a form of desire, a kind of a will to want to make things right, draw us back into our next incarnation. So desire is not something that is to be seen as negative. It is this connection where the karma or an action that has been done out of the selfish side of our ego in our wishes, desires, and thoughts that bring about actions that are not so constructive. And then the training on the other part of it, the swing of the training on the other part, where we can start to learn to be selfless through those parts where we can let the thoughts of great leaders, great masters on a sense of an elevated noble virtue rather than that of a sort of a group or a sectarian kind of coercion into behaviorisms. I mean, there's many things in the world where we can see that happening in the world, where we are being herded, so to say, into group behaviors that are not necessarily so positive, but we can on an individual basis learn to allow ourselves to read the wishes, the needs, the desires of other people, the needs of a community, the needs of the world, and start to train our will to participate in the world out of a very different position, which is the sense, and moving towards a balance at this point between the sort of the selfish wishes, desires, and thoughts of the egotistic self, and training ourselves towards a more open, receptive selflessness towards participating in the world out of a different level of morality. But yes, through meditation, through taking in these elevated thoughts, we can train our thoughts, our desires and our wishes not to be so attached to that which we want as an outcome, not to lose that entirely, but to align our wishes and what we want as an outcome with a greater connectivity to the needs and the outcomes that the world need to become a more moral and a more humane society and world around us. So these are some of the thoughts that arise from me as I read this lecture. As I said, it's well worth reading this lecture through again and again, because so much happens. As we go the later lectures in this lecture cycle, we will see that that is true of more and more of these lectures, that they are obviously very reports of what happened, and each paragraph, each sentence requires unpacking in its own right. So there are some thoughts. Our role as human being in the world around us requires a sense of self, but also a sense of a journey of releasing ourselves from our attachment to our egotistic self to that of becoming, through training our thoughts, through training our wishes, through training our desires, to be able to participate in out of self-awareness, and through that then developing the senses for the higher worlds. So that's another whole theme, is that it is possible for us to become self-aware in the psychic or the astral world and in the spiritual world. But the development of those senses isn't addressed in this lecture, but it is something that becomes more and more interesting as we go on the spiritual path, is how do we train, develop, transform, find higher and higher sets of senses that give us a capacity to read the soul worlds and to read the spiritual worlds, and not just the physical social world around us. So, fantastic. Okay, well, wishing you a good day. I will post the next lecture up on my Facebook page, and give another commentary later on. So, keep well.